Hey everyone, and welcome to video 4 for chapter 29. For this one, we're going to be talking about the influence of revolution. The impact of the American and French revolutions wasn't only about other revolutions like the ones that we talked about in the previous video. It also had a profound impact on the way people viewed society, as well as on disenfranchised groups such as women and slaves. First, we're going to talk about the ideological impact. While the American-French revolutions inspired other revolutions in the Americas, it also inspired ideological movements in Europe. An ideology is a way of looking at the world, be it human nature, government, social hierarchy, whatever. Two such ideologies that crystallized during this era are conservatism and liberalism. Now, we use these words a lot in our own political discussion, and the modern iterations of these ideologies aren't exactly the same as from this period, but they certainly trace their roots to it, right? There are certainly similarities. First, let's look at conservatism. Now, you look at the word conserve, right? Conserve means to kind of, save, but also means to keep things the way they are. This arose as a response to the challenges of society in the American and French revolutions. Conservatives believed society changed slowly over generations, that it wasn't meant to change in very, very quick leaps and bounds. Thinkers like Edmund Burke, they condemned radical change because it led to anarchy. And they used the different revolutions, or Burke used the different revolutions as example. He approved of the American Revolution because he saw it as a natural progression of North American society. But he condemned the French Revolution because he says, look at the chaos that ensued. He said it was a chaotic assault on European society. Now, by contrast, liberalism embraces change as normal agents of progress, right? And liberalism, that's why a lot of times they'll refer to liberals today as progressives. They view conservatism as a way to maintain the privileges of the elites, and also to avoid dealing with the injustices and inequalities of society. They said social change should be managed to benefit all of society. They celebrated Enlightenment values of freedom and equality. They favored republican forms of government, but they didn't always favor democracy, and that's important to remember. Some liberals considered it dangerous because it could lead to what James Madison, the main framer of our own Constitution, called tyranny of the masses, right? They didn't really trust the common people to have too much say in it. Many liberals did recognize, though, that a central theme of pretty much all the revolutions in the Americas was suffrage. Now, suffrage essentially comes down to the right to vote. Move me out of the way. There we go. It became a central theme because of the Enlightenment idea of popular sovereignty. Right? The people needed the right to vote in order to choose their sovereigns. The American and French revolutions both championed the notion of equality for all, but neither really adopted it. Leaders of these new republics all put voting restrictions in place. They viewed voting more as a privilege than a right, so they placed qualifications on voting. It was typically restricted to white men who own property. This excluded large sections of the populations, and the language set forth in the Declaration of Independence and the Declaration of the Rights of Men, it set a standard that other groups could eventually aspire to. So while obviously, blacks couldn't vote, women couldn't vote, even men without property couldn't vote. It still set a standard that non-property white males, non-white males, and eventually women used to gain their own rights to vote. And the next two slides that we're going to be looking at will show how the limits of revolutionary ideals tested, how it was applied to slaves and women. So first, let's talk about slavery. Now, as I said before, the statement, all men are created equal in the Declaration of Independence, that was fully accepted by pretty much none of the men who signed the Declaration. However, it did give fuel for people who truly did believe it. This in turn led to movements, the first one to end the slave trade. Now, we talked about this already in the previous chapter on Africa, so just a quick kind of recap of it. This movement formalized after the Enlightenment with voices like Olaudah Equiano, right? Remember him? And then Britain was the first to end the slave trade in 1807. Denmark, but in terms of the major slave trading countries, Britain was the first one, followed by the U.S. the following year, and then France, Netherlands, and Spain finally a number of decades later. And because Britain was the first one to get involved, and because their navy was so powerful, they actively began patrolling the Atlantic for illegal slavers. And by 1867, the Atlantic slave trade was completely extinct. Now, a much bigger issue was the abolition of slavery itself. Even though slave owners resisted with all their might, the end of the slave trade pretty much guaranteed that slavery was on the way out. And slavery in South America ended with with Spanish rule. Once these countries gained their independence, one of the first things that they pretty much all did was end slavery. Some not always for the right reasons, right? Mexico abolished slavery because it didn't want any more white Americans coming down into Mexico in order to start cotton plantations. But still, they ended slavery before the United States. So you look at British colonies in 1833, you got the U.S. after the Civil War in 1865, and Brazil was the last major one in the Western Hemisphere to end it in 1888. Now, however, this did not result in political equality. Okay, you still had a tremendous amount of political inequality even after freedom. Outside of Haiti, freed slaves were on the bottom tier of society in every Western Hemisphere country. They had very low-paying work, little opportunity for advancement, most times even few opportunities for land ownership. So that's important to remember, right? Freedom did not equal equality. The other group who really tested the limits of revolutionary ideals were women. Let me move myself back over here. Women were actively involved in the American and French revolutions, but were not granted the right to vote by either of them. The abolition movement, though, gave more of a voice to the women's rights movement. A lot of women crusaded to end slavery, and they saw a parallel in their own struggle for political rights. Many of them also, they turned to the Enlightenment, for the Enlightenment ideals for support. Most of the philosophers held fairly conservative views regarding women, but their work was adapted by women to aid in their struggle. You see the quote from Mary Wollstonecraft, "I do not wish women to have power over men, but just over themselves," right? So just it's fairness. It's about equity, if not even equality. They claim to have all the inalienable rights that John Locke wrote about, and that the consent of the governed applied in the home as well as in government. However, by looking at this painting of one of the salons here, you can see that women were always vastly outnumbered by men, right? You see at most maybe 2 or 3 women. So while they did participate, it was a guys' club, right? You don't talk about the famous philosophers in the Enlightenment were still all men, and they were fairly conservative when it came to their views on gender. Women did play a very prominent role in the French Revolution. An example, in October of 1789, thousands of women marched to the Royal Palace in Versailles to protest the price of bread, and they actually forced the king and his family to return with them to Paris. Other women, like Olympe de Gouges, they played active roles in the revolution. Her assertion that women should have equal rights prompted her to write the Declaration of the Rights of Women and the Female Citizen. This claimed that women should have the same rights afforded to men by the revolution. Unfortunately for Gouges, her loud insistence on equal rights ended up showing the true nature of the men running the revolution, and she was sent to the guillotine because she was viewed as being a threat. Nevertheless, the Enlightenment ideals and revolutionary spirit contributed greatly to the women's rights movement in the 19th century, right? So as we get into the 1800s, women like Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who was an American who started as an abolitionist, and she became a strong supporter of female equality. Women like her, they organized a conference of feminists in Seneca Falls in 1848. Now, while it wouldn't be until the 20th century that most Western nations granted women the right to vote, the reforming spirit of the 18th century revolutions would lay a foundation upon which later movements could build. Okay, so that's about the influence of revolution, and then for the next and final video for this chapter, we're going to be talking about the creation and consolidation of new nations in Europe.